All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for the seventh episode of this live stream series. I hope you can hear me okay. Um, so, a few things. First, so the piano, I had the piano tuned, hoping that it would sound better. Unfortunately, the tuner was having a bad day, or maybe he has a personal grudge against me because it sounds terrible. It sounds worse than before he came. So if you notice some notes that sound really out of tune, it's this fantastic tuner that did a terrible job on my piano. So in any case, that's unfortunate, but that's just something we have to deal with. Um, and all right, so today we're going to be talking about the Nocturne. I'm going to be playing works that are only nocturnes, but from three different composers: John Field, Chopin, and Charles Valentin Alkan. And of course, the Nocturne is most commonly associated with Chopin because he is the composer who really elevated it as a genre and wrote many masterpieces that were nocturnes. So, still very much associated with Chopin, but others have written nocturnes before Chopin and also after. Composers like John Field, who wrote them before Chopin, but afterwards Scriabin, Glinka, Tchaikovsky, Grieg, and then even later on, composers like Debussy, who wrote nocturnes for orchestra. So, and even going back earlier, the nocturne was a type of, I wouldn't say a genre, but a type of piece in the classical period. Mozart and Haydn wrote nocturnes, but they were completely different from the Romantic nocturne. They were just kind of ensemble pieces that were to be played in the evening outdoors for some sort of like party or celebration. They really have nothing to do with the Romantic genre, the Romantic nocturne. So the Romantic nocturne is kind of like the archetype of the Romantic form. It's very, very lyrical, and it has a lot of the qualities that we associate with European Romanticism. So if we think about classicism, the Enlightenment, rational thought, using deductive reasoning, the scientific method, the truth content of reality can be found through reason. So in the Romantic period, we're kind of moving against that a little bit. And so the nighttime and dreaming and this kind of obscure vision can really play a role in that. And the nocturne really comes to represent that, in that when the sun begins to set, suddenly our vision is changed. The objects no longer are clear in our vision. They start to have a shadow. Forms become somewhat blurred. Also, this kind of being able to distinguish between night and day, to be able to see clearly, and then from a psychological perspective, everything that entails. So it's a much more inward-looking genre, much more inward-looking period in music history, dealing with individual sentiment, with very subjective kind of ideas. In the night, we kind of can experience this. So although we don't see clearly, possibly, we are staring into the abyss, staring at the infinite, and it's through that infinite that then what it returns back to us is the image of ourself and our inner life. Also, at night, the thief, the lover, become one. We can no longer distinguish between those who mean well and who mean to hurt us. So even if sin is definitely associated with night, there still is this kind of cloaked aspect to it. In Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, it's during the night that the two characters are able to meet and be able to express their love for each other in that hidden place. So nighttime has a lot to do with Romanticism, and the Nocturne is really a genre. It's really a truly romantic genre, and it embodies a lot of those ideas. So as I mentioned, Chopin wrote the great nocturnes, but he didn't invent the genre, even in its form, even in its romantic form. And what I mean by that is for solo piano. There are some examples of nocturnes for piano and violin, but they're very rare. It's really a solo piano genre, very, very lyrical. That's kind of one of the main characteristics. And so the first composer I'm going to talk about is John Field. And John Field, unfortunately for him, he's really often just a footnote in Chopin's biography. Chopin wrote nocturnes. A footnote, nocturnes were first written by John Field, Irish composer, whatever. That's usually about it. And sometimes as teaching material, but he really was an important figure in music history. But this happens a lot with composers, someone like Chopin or Beethoven, who are so dominant in their creativity, they cast such a huge shadow that it kind of obliterates everyone, especially composers that came like right before them. So early Romanticism, early Classicism, these composers often are completely forgotten because a lot of the things that they were trying out were then mastered by composers like Chopin or Beethoven, of course. So Field kind of falls in that category. He was born in 1782 in Dublin. So he was born 12 years after Beethoven. And he quickly moved to London to study with Muzio Clementi, who was an Italian pianist, piano manufacturer, composer. And the two of them at one point went on tour through Europe. They went to Paris, they went to Vienna, and they also went to St. Petersburg. This was in 1802. And Field had such success in St. Petersburg that he decided to stay. He also found employment with one of the aristocratic families. And so he was able to stay and really he lived for the majority of his life in Russia, between St. Petersburg and Moscow. He was very influential. He had a strong influence on Russian composers. Glinka, for example, was a student of his for a period of time, but also on other European romantic composers. Chopin, of course, Liszt, Brahms, Schumann. Many of them cite Field as one of their as a composer that they appreciated. And so Field started writing these nocturnes around 1810, 1811. He didn't call them nocturnes originally. Originally they were called romances or sérénades or berceuses, different evocative names. And then finally in around 1812 he decided to publish the first of those pieces, so they'd already been written but with different titles, as Nocturne Number 1. And that probably meant that he had planned on writing many, which he ended up doing. So he really invented this genre. And what's interesting is that Field was known as a pianist. He was a well-known pianist and teacher. He was known to have an incredibly sweet and soft tone in his playing. That's this beautiful singing tone. That's what he was most known for. And it's in his nocturnes that he really is able to bring that out. So these nocturnes are, of course, very lyrical, and that would have brought out these qualities in his playing. Some say it was connected to the pianos of the time that he might have encountered in London with Clementi, that these pianos were starting to become more lyrical, that the tone was starting to become a little rounder, whereas before it was maybe more metallic. So here Field was really well known for this beautiful singing quality that came from Italian opera and Italian lyricism that he then kind of transposed into the nocturne, the solo piano style. So what we have here in the nocturnes, right hand really representing the vocalist. So long melodic lines, usually one voice, that then are ornamented or given some variation. Then the left hand is the accompaniment, the harmonic support. And what's new here is the kind of style of accompaniment that Field uses. So a lot of this is based on a bass note that is then caught in the pedal and then kind of an arpeggiated figure afterwards, something like this. Or like this. So we always have that bass note and then something else above, sometimes chords, sometimes arpeggiation. So we have these two textures, the accompaniment in the left hand with that pedal, and then the right hand singing cantabile line that comes, that's kind of separated from it. So this was really something that Field pursued in a lot of his music, and that really represented his own playing very well. And I think he had a significant influence on the Russian piano school, and I think that influence could even still be felt to today. So one of the big characteristics of the Russian piano school, whether it still exists, who knows, but it's that singing quality, especially of the right hand, really bringing out that color. And there's one could say that it's Field who really started that. And then before, so I'm going to be playing two of them, number 2 in C minor and number 5 in B flat major. And one last thing, so these were published in 1812, but it was actually then in Russia, but it was actually Franz Liszt in 1859 that published the first really important European publication with, I think at first 6 nocturnes and then more. But Liszt really loved these nocturnes, and he wrote this preface, which is very beautifully written with all this incredibly descriptive language typical for the Romantic period, and speaking about how the innocence, the naivete in the works, and he even then compares them to Chopin, because as you will see, well, maybe I'll get to that later, but let's just listen to the Field Nocturne. So number 2 in C minor and number 5 in B flat major. So as you can hear, they are relatively simple works with usually one basic um, emotional idea, I would say. There's not much in terms of contrast, but they're quite lovely, and I think it's important to put them into the historical context because so much of it sounds what you'd call Chopinesque, but Chopin was 28 years younger than Field. So when Field wrote these pieces, Chopin was like 1 year old. Like Field is closer to Beethoven, much closer than he is to Chopin. So to describe these pieces as being Chopinesque, it makes no sense because Chopin hadn't written anything when these were composed. Of course, Chopin then took a lot of this and elevated it to masterpiece status, let's say. But it's still interesting, and what Liszt in his preface to the edition talks about is, yes, Chopin gives us much more in terms of contrast, in terms of varying emotions. That it's not just this kind of naive, simple, somewhat sentimental aspect, aesthetic, but it's much more somber. There's anguish. There's much more subtlety of emotion, so much wider palette of emotional content. But in Field's defense, what Liszt says is, yes, that is true about Chopin, but why can we not just enjoy these little moments of innocence, almost like you're sitting, he describes it something like sitting next to a stream under a tree, like some sort of oasis, this simple pleasure. I mean, I think we can all relate to that. So I think there is a place for this music. And the other thing about the Nocturne that's important to know, and as we talk about Chopin, it becomes even more important, is the setting. So in the Romantic period, we have this paradox. We have very large works, symphonies that take gigantic proportion, as well as sonatas, but then also the miniature. So nocturnes are kind of part of this miniature style of composing that was much more well suited for the salon setting. So a much more intimate kind of living room type setting that was frequented by these composers, Chopin and Alkan as well, and by many of the wealthy aristocrats of the time. Many of them women who would end up being piano students of Chopin and of Alkan. So these nocturnes definitely have a very strong relationship to the salon setting, and they're really ideal pieces for that. One more thing, generally, the nocturne is associated with femininity more so than masculinity, let's say, as a genre. In that, I think some of the characteristics that they often express were, at least at the time, much more associated with women. This kind of much more sensitive approach, the ornate, the way that the melodies are kind of decorated. But it's also the fact that, as I said, in these salons, many of the audience members were women, but it was the role of the piano in the 19th century. So for a woman of a certain social standing, being able to play the piano was something that was very favorable. So this was exactly the type of piece that many of these women would play, and that Chopin would probably have taught. So it's very much associated with that as well. And then for Chopin, I mean, just as a character, he really was not the opposite necessarily, but in contrast to Liszt. So Liszt would be this much more orchestral, athletic piano playing, and Chopin was much more delicate, much more refined, and much more subtle. And that goes very much with the aesthetic of these nocturnes. They're generally quite hushed. In the Chopin, there are some very dramatic moments, but even then, and it was said about Chopin's playing that he always played soft, so much so that someone, after leaving a concert, said, I have to scream all the way home because everything was just piano, so soft the entire time, it drove me crazy. So back to Chopin. Chopin wrote nocturnes, of course, among other things, and he really, as I said many times, elevated the genre. I'm not going to give you much about Chopin's biography. He's famous enough. Born in 1810, died in 1849 of tuberculosis. And so he knew Field's pieces. He taught them. I don't know if he ever played them publicly, but he, of course, was very clearly inspired by these nocturnes. And as I said, Chopin does more with them. He often has this contrasting middle section. That's probably one of the main things. But why is it that Chopin's nocturnes are better? I mean, it's of course there's this, we hear them and maybe we get more pleasure, maybe the emotion is deeper, but even on a very straightforward compositional sense, we can look at some of the reasons. First thing probably is melody. So Field's melodies are relatively systematic and predictable. So you generally know how the song is going to go once you've heard it once. Chopin, that's not the case. I think he gets this from Mozart, this constant inventiveness in the melody, something that makes it never feel square. So with Chopin, you're never going to have that feeling of, oh yes, I know what comes next, it comes on the downbeat, whatever. He's always going to be finding ways to surprise you a little bit, or little turns of phrase that bring this little elegance, this little moment of fantasy to the melody, whether that's starting it on a weak beat or having an unequal number of measures in the phrase. All of these little things that are so detailed, but that really give this impression of improvisation and of fresh, new melodies constantly, similar to Mozart. Second thing, counterpoint. So Chopin studied Bach. His counterpoint is flawless. His voice leading is perfect. It's far superior to many of his contemporaries. And that also, I think, without even knowing, these are the things, the intricacies that we don't necessarily hear, but that are there and that add to this. Of course, the harmonic language too, and then just generally the ability to be incredibly creative with everything he did. I mean, the only criticism that Chopin really can get is in his orchestration, I think, of the two piano concertos. Aside from that, I mean, he really was, at least in terms of piano writing, close to the perfect composer. So what's interesting about Chopin as a pianist is that he came to Paris and he didn't play very much in public, but he played quite often in these salon settings. And his playing was very, very sensitive. He, as I said, played often quite soft, but like Field, had this really singing touch. With his students, he was always obsessed with legato, so playing really these smooth phrasings with a gentle touch, very much against kind of the bashing or the athletic pianism, and that of course is reflected in his music. So he was really considered one of the great pianists at the time in Paris, but he didn't have that big public personality, but he enchanted many audience members in those salon settings. So I'm going to play two nocturnes, the first in G minor, Opus 37 number 1, and the second in F minor, Opus 55 number 1, and you can listen for what Chopin does differently. You'll hear contrasting middle section, but then listen also to the detail in the accompaniment in the left hand, but then the way, particularly the melodic, the inventiveness in the melody. Even if there's a certain repetitive nature, he's always doing something that enchants us, and that never really, even if the nocturne has a sleep-like quality associated with it, it always is being continually reinvented in Chopin's incredible melodic writing. So two nocturnes, G minor, Opus 37, number 1, F minor, Opus 55, number 1. All right. And our next and final nocturne composer is Charles Valentin Alkan. So, not very well known, although he really, at least among pianists, has known a kind of resurgence over the past 30, 40 years. I'd say particularly through the recordings of the French-Canadian pianist Marc-André Hamelin. I think that's how I was introduced to Alkan's piano music. So Alkan was a contemporary of Chopin. Of course, he lived longer. Most people did. But he was born in 1813, died in 1888. So just 3 years younger than Chopin, but very much that same group. And he lived in the same area for a while with Chopin. So Chopin and Georges Sand lived together in an apartment in the Square d'Orléans in an area in Paris. And it became kind of like an epicenter for artistic activity. Alkan lived there for a while, as well as Alexandre Dumas and Pauline Viardot with her husband. So in any case, it was an area of really exciting artistic happenings. And so Alkan was very much part of this generation, but he was kind of still yearning for the Ancien Régime, so pre-revolutionary France, which is interesting. So he had this conservative approach to life and to music. He was Jewish and practiced his religion with great dedication throughout his life, also translating the Bible and the New Testament. So he really studied in a very intense way. That was a very important part of his life. But just generally, so this was a trend in the 19th century among certain groups that kind of yearned for life before the revolution, which meant kind of upholding certain moral and possibly artistic values. That after the revolution, there was this emergence of this new bourgeoisie that to some lacked the sophistication and the ethical and moral foundation necessary. So in any case, he was kind of like that. But musically too, he was oriented a little bit more towards the German forms. He wrote these huge sonatas for piano that are incredibly virtuosic. Not, I say plural, really just one big sonata. A symphony for solo piano, a concerto for solo piano. So these huge works, he's known for this great virtuosity. And he was a great virtuoso pianist in his lifetime. But not all of his pieces are like that. He also, as I talked about, has these miniatures. So these really are very, very much part of that romantic tradition. And Alkan, like Chopin, wrote many small pieces. His Nocturne, Opus 22, that I'll play for you, is an example. So Alkan was a well-known pianist, although he was kind of a recluse. He would perform for a few years, be quite active, composing and performing, and then he would kind of disappear. I think he suffered from anxiety, but various issues that he had with contemporary society that made it difficult for him to really have the kind of career that he deserved. And he was also a teacher, so as I talked about with Chopin, so he and Chopin both were part of this kind of salon group, and that's where they would find a lot of their students. Because both Chopin and Alkan made a living teaching. They made a living teaching privately, too, these wealthy families, and as I mentioned, usually the younger women in the family. So that's really how he made a living. And then when Chopin died, Alkan actually inherited a lot of his students, as well as Chopin, when he died, he was working on this new method book for piano, kind of how to develop technique, and that was also something that was given to Alkan when Chopin died. So he's very much in the same tradition. What's interesting about Alkan, there are all these crazy stories about him, and the crazy, not craziest necessarily, but the thing most people know about Alkan is the way he supposedly died. So apparently what people think is that he was reaching in his bookcase for the Talmud, which traditionally is always the highest book in the bookcase. He was reaching up for it and fell, and the entire bookshelf fell upon him, and he was crushed and died. So this story has been just in circulation since his death, but apparently it's not completely true. I don't know. It sounds. I mean, why not? Let's just say it's true. The reality might be much less romantic. Maybe he just kind of fell over, passed out. Something fell on him. He was stuck for 24 hours and just died. I mean, who knows? In any case, that's a very common story that's told about Alkan. So it's really interesting because again with Field, I mean, we could say that he's a minor composer, but it's always interesting to look at these composers. So it's not to say that one is necessarily better than the other. Maybe Chopin is better than Alkan, but Alkan, what he can reveal to us is the nature of music making at that time. So Chopin was an exceptional composer. He really was. It's the type of composer that comes, once a generation, if that. But it's really in looking at these minor composers that we get to see another side. So in the Alkan that you're going to hear, I mean, this is such a typical Parisian salon piece, something that you really could have heard if you were in Paris in that milieu during those years. So, of course, Chopin is representative of some type of genius, but there are many other composers that are really worth looking at because they can reveal so much about the era and almost are more representative of the era because most composers weren't writing what Chopin was writing. They were maybe writing versions of it. And then even Alkan, I mean, he has a lot of his own personal ideas and his own idiosyncratic way of approaching harmony, pianistic techniques. So there's really much to be appreciated there. And of course, for pianists, a lot of the big virtuoso stuff is incredibly challenging and fulfilling. All right, so to finish, the Nocturne Opus 22 by Charles Valentin Alkan. All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions, type them into the chat and I'll answer them.